I think overall the message is that Cook Inlet king salmon are continuing to experience a prolonged period of poor productivity, meaning that our runs are just not sufficient enough to provide any harvest opportunity or even to make our escapement goals. So unfortunately, we're faced with a need to continue to close a lot of fisheries overall here in Cook Inlet, just to maximize the escapements and give these stocks a chance to rebuild. That said, in kind of the combination of that, we're very fortunate here in Homer to still have the opportunities that we do. And so some of this year's regulations, they're mostly the same as they've been for the last couple of years in saltwater. Anglers are still able to fish for king salmon year-round here in Homer. In the summer, we have several fisheries available for anglers to participate in. For saltwater anglers, the boat-based fishery here in Lower Cook Inlet, south of Bluff Point, will be still 1 king a day this summer. So, and then we have our enhanced fisheries here in Kachemak Bay, the Dudiak fishing lagoon on the Homer Spit, and Seldovia. Both of those are without restrictions, and anglers are able to harvest 2 kings a day from there. And then up the road in Ninilchik, we have the Ninilchik River that's stocked with hatchery king salmon. That one is one where we've had some slight changes to this year's emergency order action. It's still going to be open for hatchery fish, but with that one, we're with a shorter season and a bag limit of just 1 hatchery king. So, but overall, we're still maintaining harvest opportunity for our enhanced locations here in Homer. When we say Cook Inlet salmon, that means every fish that's returning to spawn within the Cook Inlet drainages. So starting up north in the Mat-Su area, the Susitna, Little Susitna drainages, Yetna, all of those northern stocks. There's over 40 king salmon stocks for that area. And then here on the Kenai Peninsula, we have the Kenai early and late run king salmon stocks, Kasilof early run and late run stocks, and then the lower Kenai Peninsula roadside streams that we have here, Anchor River, Deep Creek, Ninilchik River. Those are our Cook Inlet stocks. The winter fishery is structured separately from summer fisheries and regulation that's been established by the Board of Fish. And the winter fishery has a management plan with a guideline harvest level of 5,500 king salmon. The intention of the management plan is to, to stabilize the harvest of king salmon at a low level, but still being able to provide some opportunity. The winter fishery is unique and structured in the time that it is because that's when there are no Cook Inlet king salmon stocks here in Kachemak Bay. And so these are primarily what we call feeder kings, or immature king salmon that are out feeding in the ocean, growing before they return to spawn. The harvest here is comprised of stocks from throughout the Pacific Northwest, primarily from Oregon and Washington, British Columbia, Southeast Alaska. So it's a highly mixed fishery, and no one stock dominates the harvest. Chinook salmon or king salmon supplementation programs throughout the Pacific Northwest there's a lot of them, and they're very diverse, and they have lots of different intentions, but they're primarily set up for harvest opportunities in the locations for where they're stocked. But because those fish are out rearing in the ocean and are mixed, they show up here. So we do see those in the harvest over time. to be able to tell you what percentage of the harvest or what their contribution is to the fishery. We're not really sure. Based on the stocking levels in places like the Columbia River or British Columbia, you would assume that a large percentage of the harvest that occurs here, or a substantial portion of the harvest that occurs here for those stocks is hatchery fish. The Dudiak Lagoon's been, you know, kind of plugging along. We've had some years here where, you know, our downturn in Chinook salmon have, you know, resulted in kind of poorer returns. And what we've done over the last handful of years is kind of increase the stocking level up a little bit more there. So historically it was 200,000 smolt that we stocked. Was seeing around a marine survival of around 1% with that release. So we were harvesting a couple thousand king salmon off of that. Marine survival kind of went down a little bit, and so we took what was our Halibut Cove Lagoon stocking and brought those fish here to the Dudiak Lagoon to kind of consolidate our stockings to provide a more robust harvest, you know, at the Dudiak Lagoon that's road accessible for anglers that don't have boats. And that's worked pretty well for us. We've been getting a harvest of somewhere around 1,000 fish, not as many as we would want because marine survival has continued to decline with our enhanced Chinook fisheries here. So we're in a pretty good place. I mean, the Dudiak Lagoon is a very unique terminal fishery. It's, as far as I know, it's one of the more successful Chinook stocking locations where they're stocked directly into salt water. They're not imprinting on any fresh water at all at that location, but it works really well. Last year's fishing was fairly good. One thing I'll say, just kind of as a benefit to anglers, is run timing with these smaller runs has been a little bit later, where historically we would see good numbers of kings in the Dudiak Lagoon by Memorial Day. That's shifted a little bit. If you're planning to come here and fish the Dudiak Lagoon, it would be worth waiting till about the second weekend in June. The second and third weekend of June has been probably some of our better fishing, but it's still a really great opportunity to catch hatchery king salmon. There's dedicated anglers there that are very successful at catching fish, and with a little bit of effort, I think anybody can catch one there. The best fishing there is when the tide is actually flooding into the lagoon, and so you need a tide height of at least 13 feet for that to happen. And so you're fishing associated around high tide with it, so fishing on the incoming tide as it's approaching high tide. Seldovia is a really unique opportunity for those coming to Homer to visit, because you can do a day trip over there in any capacity. You could ferry over in any way, fly over, and go fish for king salmon over there. The stocking level is 100,000 there, so it's a third of the Dudiak Lagoon, and so we've been getting, you know, probably somewhere around a harvest of around a few hundred fish there annually. But it's a really neat place to go for a day trip from Homer, and it's actually really productive fishing. People fish from, there's a road bridge over there that people fish from, or down along the bank on the incoming tide. So it's a kind of a tidal base, but it's fishing. There's a slough that goes through the harbor and then into a lagoon, and king salmon kind of mill and go back and forth, and at times are pretty aggressive, and anglers do pretty well over there. So it's a unique opportunity. I would say it's a semi-remote place that's pretty affordable to get to in comparison to some of our more remote fisheries. So yeah, it's a good opportunity for sure. You know, the tides do make a difference. It tends to fish at the beginning of the incoming tide over there because there's no barrier to the sill. So like, yeah, +5, +7 is a really good time to fish Seldovia on the incoming in the slough. In the lagoon itself, at high tide is probably best over there. For the most part, we didn't do any sampling with those fish that were around, but we do know that last year was the largest run of sockeye to the Kenai River. Those fish essentially were everywhere in the inlet, and we were very fortunate for a week here to see them on the Homer Spit. That was a very unique situation that I don't think very many people have ever seen, just to speak to how large that Kenai run was. It'll be interesting to see if that happens again, and the excitement that kind of went around with that. So yeah, they're most certainly upper Cook Inlet sockeye salmon last year that we had here. I think what we were seeing was there were so many of them that they were staged from here all the way to the mouths of those two rivers. I mean, the Kenai, I think the total run ended up being over 10 million. That's just to the Kenai. So yeah, I mean, in the downturn of king salmon, the one thing that we've had here on the Kenai Peninsula, and we're very fortunate to have, is really strong runs of sockeye salmon. We're with a forecast that's very similar. It's not quite as large as last year, though I would anticipate it being similar. Just knowing that our forecasts are, just good enough to put us into the ballpark. We'll see how strong they are. Like the Kachemak River last year, the number of fish that we counted the first day with the sonar was substantial. I think we counted, 10% of the lower end of the escapement goal on the first day of sonar operation, just to suggest how large the run actually was. There's probably a decent bit of fish before that. So yes, we're with a lot of sockeye here, and pretty great opportunity. It was very, very neat to see last year for sure. With salmon, both in freshwater and saltwater, they each have their niche, and they're very different fish for where they go, what they feed on, behavior. Everything is completely different with them, and so that's why we're able to see really large runs of sockeye while king salmon are doing poorly. They're very different fish. Sockeye primarily feed on zooplankton in the ocean, where Chinook are, feed on forage fish like herring, sand lance, capelin. Very different food chain. Sockeye are, farther up the food chain. Chinook are farther down. And then there's some similarities too with those two. They both spend a few years in the ocean and can come back from 1 to 4 years or 5 years for Chinook. So where pink salmon go out and they start off as feeding on zooplankton, and then they shift to forage fish at the end, but they only spend 1 year in the ocean. So that's going to affect, how long you spend in the ocean is going to affect your survival as well. But no, even Chinook and coho that are, more similar as far as behavior for feeding, they don't necessarily overlap. We don't see coho salmon here in Kachemak Bay at all, even though they eat the exact same things as Chinook in the ocean. Their survival is a little bit better, but it's primarily because they only spend 1 year in the ocean, where Chinook spend 1 to 4. So our survivals are really poor because our primary age class of our Chinook here for our early run stocks in Cook Inlet are 3 salt fish. So it takes 3 years for a female to mature and then come back. And so we do tend to see better returns of younger fish, small males, than older fish. So that's a part of the survival. If you're programmed to have, 50 to 75% of your run come back as 3 and 4 salts compared to a fish like a coho that's all programmed to come back after 1 year, your survival is going to be much less. So at the Dudiak Lagoon, we were just talking about kings, but we also stock the Dudiak Lagoon with silvers, and that's been pretty good. Last year wasn't super strong, and 24 was kind of weak, but I suspect, at any point we can have a stronger run of those there. And the marine survival of coho on average has been about 1%, where we've been less than 0.5% for Chinook. So we stock 100,000 coho into the Dudiak Lagoon, so like we're expecting around 1,000. Very easy for us to have a harvest of 2,000 or 4,000 even with poor productivity. And when it's really good, we've seen survivals as high as 10 to 12% for coho in some years. It's been probably a little over a decade, but we most certainly have had 10,000 fish runs off of 100,000 fish stockings at the Dudiak Lagoon. Rockfish are a tricky one. They're not like our salmon where we have weirs or sonar set up on rivers to count the escapement. Rockfish are definitely susceptible to over-harvest due to kind of their life history. They're long-lived, they're late to mature. They have low recruitment, or their reproduction is not in a way that is booming at any point. And so we need to be with a lack of information, we don't have much for assessment besides harvest data and biological compositions of the harvest data. But without more robust assessment of those stocks, we have to be fairly conservative with our rockfish harvest. And so that has us reducing the bag limits right now in an attempt to stabilize the harvest of rockfish. So there's still really good numbers of black rockfish out there. The harvests that we're seeing right now, though, are generally increasing because effort towards rockfish has been increasing. And I would say that we want to progress towards a more progressive management approach instead of just by emergency order. But until then, I would expect to see, at a minimum, another emergency order action similar to last year. The halibut regulations are established through that's a federal fishery, and it's in cooperation with the International Pacific Halibut Commission, and so there's a halibut catch sharing plan that got implemented in 2014, and that allocates the what they calculate to be the total available harvest annually between the guided sport fishery and the commercial fisheries, primarily long lining, that harvest halibut. So it goes through an annual process of looking at the performance of the harvest as it was structured last year for those fisheries to stay within their allocation, and what the expectation is for this year's total harvest. And then they start structuring the guided sport fishery to try to stay within that harvest. That's the most basic way that I can explain a very complex management structure with it. But yeah, that's all done through federal fisheries management. They collect a tremendous amount of data. The Department of Fish and Game does provide them biological compositions, primarily average weight from charter anglers in every port. If you're in the Homer Harbor this summer, you might see our port sampler down there sampling the catch, and that information is provided to both the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council and the data to the IPHC. So yes, we have an involvement. We have a vested interest in, maintaining the halibut fishery here. I mean, we're still, for now, the halibut capital of the world. There's been more halibut harvested here than in sport fisheries than all of Southeast Alaska combined. The halibut stock is still robust enough to support, good harvest opportunities, but there's been some changes and it's not as robust as it once was. And so, harvest opportunities are being scaled back to make sure that those are sustainable for the stock. Just generally speaking, shellfish in Cook Inlet have been struggling for quite a long time. I think, we saw what kind of described as a regime shift starting in the 70s, from where Kachemak Bay was very productive waters for shellfish. We had king crab, Dungeness, tanner crab, shrimp, hardshell clams. And with that regime shift over time, what we've seen is that these waters are now more productive for groundfish instead of shellfish. And that's a double-edged sword when it comes to shellfish, because one of the primary sources of mortality for juvenile crab are groundfish. What we have now is a really small kind of residual populations of shellfish in comparison to what they were historically. I mean, it's fascinating to think about people harvesting king crab from the Homer Harbor, and that, tanner crab weren't even really commercially harvested in the 70s because they had no value. They looked at them the way we might look at an Irish lord now. So yeah, times have really changed. For our tanner crab stock here, it has survived better than most of the other shellfish stocks overall, though it's still, probably over 90% declined from its historical abundance. If you think about how successful you might be setting a tanner crab pot now, you're able to go out and get a few crab for you and your friends out of one pot. It's really great. Imagine how good it would have been in the 80s, when the abundance was, that much larger. So it was a commercially robust stock here. But we have a little bit left, and it's continuing to produce a little bit of crab to being harvested. And so we have this fishery structure that's very limited, so everybody has an opportunity to go out and get some crab. The annual harvest has been about 6,000 crab. We're issuing a little over 2,000 permits, and 80 to 90% of the people fish those. And so, and most people, when they go, are successful, sometimes better than others. But for now, we have a pretty good structure with keeping the harvest, down around where it is, around 6,000. We have assessed that stock over time. Historically, with pot survey, starting in the 90s, we did trawl surveys here in the bay annually. The current fishery that we're on is structured to provide a harvest opportunity that's well below the lowest abundance that we've ever seen here in the bay. We can still do a trawl survey here. If we do a trawl survey here and the abundance meets the upper threshold, we can have more harvest opportunity. We haven't had the funding to do that survey for a little bit, but it's definitely an option. So I think we've got a good thing going with that fishery. Dungeness is an interesting one. The Alaska Board of Fisheries, opened up the subsistence Dungeness fishery here in Cook Inlet, but that can only happen in the subsistence area, so it's not everywhere. So when anglers see those crab in their sport tanner crab pot, you can't keep them from there. The intention was to just provide some kind of opportunity for subsistence users to go and see if they could find any, given that we didn't have any information. The fisheries have been closed since the late 80s, early 90s. So we haven't done a survey for Dungeness. Last pod survey we did was 2008 or 9, I think. So it had been quite some time. Even though, we might see them from time to time, we really have no idea, how many are out there. The initial reports, the permit reporting isn't completely due yet, but from those that we've talked to that participated in the fishery, they kind of struggled to find Dungeness. So we'll see how that's going to continue to go. We'll be monitoring, those harvests and see how much efforts occurred. And, if there's really not any Dungeness out there, or people weren't able to find any, then we'll go back to the Board of Fish to have them revisit the fishery.